After using the EOS R5 for almost 4 months now, shooting commercials, fashion videos, as well as a artist portrait in Italy, using it on the ice, as well as shooting with it in a crazy hailstorm, using it as a B cam to my C300 for various commercial jobs, as well as shooting a nearly 60-minute one take with the EOS R5 in 8K, I can totally give you my opinion about this camera as a dedicated video shooter right now. So like I already said, I used the EOS R5 for various commercial jobs in the past, and I already did some behind the scenes here on this channel about these, so check them out if you haven't already. And as I also just mentioned, we just shot a commercial that I just wrapped up this week with the EOS R5, and I also will do a complete breakdown about this commercial, including the budget and what the budget was for. So if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel right now if you're interested in seeing that. And while you're at it, just follow me on Instagram as well. And now we can actually start talking about the R5 for video. So first up, as always, let's talk about the body and the design. And I already talked in length about this in my R6 video, so I will not repeat myself. So go watch the R6 video if you're interested in that part, because there's only minor differences between the R5 body and the R6 body. And overall, I can say I like the body, I like shooting with it, all the customizable options you have with it. I would love for it to have a full-size HDMI or at least a mini HDMI instead of the micro HDMI. But overall, for it being a mirrorless camera, you can totally customize it to be a really great dedicated video shooter. Still, I would prefer having a real cinema camera, but for what it is, it's actually a really amazing camera to shooting videos with. If you rig it up a little bit, which I always do when shooting video, and I won't be talking about all the accessories I usually use, like a cage, top handle, microphone, etc., because I will do a dedicated video on this probably next week, comparing some different cages and giving tips on how to rig up the EOS R5 as well as the R6. So again, subscribe if you want to see that. One thing I will do say about the EOS R5 that I have said in many videos before is the use of an external monitor. And I was always annoyed when using a Canon DSLR or DSLM when shooting with an external monitor. And I think although you do have a flip out screen that isn't even half bad, me personally, as a video shooter, I always like shooting with an external monitor unless I'm really in a pinch and I want to go run and gun or shooting on a gimbal where I can't use an external monitor. I always like having that option of a bigger frame to be able to expose as well as frame my shots. And with the EOS R5, that is somewhat of a pain because you can't really choose to have the external monitor working the same way the internal monitor is working at the same time. You always have to choose to either have everything displayed on your external monitor or just have a complete clean feed on your external monitor and use the internal touchscreen as well. And that is kind of annoying because I want to at least see my focusing fields when having a clean feed on the external monitor. Because otherwise, how do I know if my subject is in focus or not when using autofocus? So for me, I always used the external monitor only, and that shut off the internal monitor, so I couldn't make use of any of the touchscreen features, and it's somewhat annoying when going through the menus, etc. But it's not that big of a deal, but still something that I would love for future firmware updates or future models to have, that I can use both screens at the same time in full capacity. Another thing that really bothers me when using the EOS R5 with an external monitor is that the view assist doesn't work on the external monitor. The view assist is basically a LUT that the camera puts on top of your flat C-Log image so that it looks a little nicer and what it would actually look like graded afterwards. But for some reason it doesn't output to your external screen. Of course, pretty much every modern external monitor has an SD card slot, so you can use your own LUTs with it. And speaking of LUTs, there aren't really any dedicated LUTs for the EOS R5 or the R6 on the Canon website. There are some for the original EOS R, but I found them to be way too punchy and not saturated enough. There are some LUTs on our website dedicated for Canon mirrorless cameras, and there's also a Rec 709 dedicated LUT in there that you could use on an external monitor, and that is the way that I use it, but I would much prefer to just have it output from the camera directly to your external monitor. Another thing that the camera doesn't output to your external monitor is focus peaking, and the focus peaking on the internal monitor is actually pretty good, and I would love for Canon to implement it that I can actually use it on my external monitor as well, but that doesn't work. So if I want to have focus peaking peaking while using an external monitor, I have to use the monitor's own focus peaking, which most of the times works very well, but one thing that always bothers me is that it also starts peaking on all your settings, and that just isn't pretty to look at. Another thing I do like to mention real quick when it comes to body is the RF mount, and I really do love the RF lenses. We have the 15-35, we also have the 28-70, and the 28-70 is my favorite lens of all time. It's so versatile, it's sharp, it has really nice bokeh, and it opens up to 2.0. So I'm using this for basically everything I shoot on the EOS R5, unless I need more wide angle. So with this, the R5 is a capable all-in-one machine for me with one lens that I can use for whatever I need it to. So having said all that, the last thing I want to talk about the body and design is the audio inputs. You only have a 3.5mm headphone jack, and for my initial behind the scenes on the EOS R5, I wanted to use the preamps. So I took a Rode NTG video mic and directed it directly into the camera via an extension cord. And for some reason, I got a lot of interference with it. I don't know what it was, maybe the cable was broken, or, which is more likely, it picked up the Wi-Fi and the Bluetooth from the camera, and that started the interference. But that was really annoying, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the preamp's fault, but since you only have a 3.5mm headphone jack and those extension cables usually aren't isolated enough for not to pick up any interference, I would always recommend just recording audio externally. As a matter of fact, I'm shooting on a C300 Mark III right now, and I'm also recording externally into my Zoom F6, and it's really convenient unless you really need to do some run and gun work and just put a shotgun microphone on top of your camera. And doing some dedicated video shooting for interviews or talking heads like this, I always recommend just record externally and just save yourself all the hassle. Alright, so now let's talk about the image quality, because that is what it all comes down to in the end, right? So when I'm using the EOS R5, I shot most of the things in 4K 50 or in 4K 25. And I used the HQ mode for whenever I wasn't worried about overheating at all. And the 4K HQ mode looks absolutely spectacular. We used this on the recent commercial that we shot because everything was filmed in 25 frames, and it looked absolutely amazing. It's tech sharp, and it's even sharper than my C300 Mark III. So whenever I'm using this for interview setups, it's always great to have the 4K HQ mode on the EOS R5. Pretty much all the other times we're using the EOS R5, we shoot in 4K 50, and that is for our YouTube behind the scenes or B-roll for commercial. And as a matter of fact, when we shot this artist portrait in Italy, we shot everything in 4K 50 to have the option to slow everything down in post. And the 4K 50 out of this camera also looks amazing. It's line skipped though, so it's not oversampling from the entire 8K sensor like the 4K 25 in the HQ mode. And I would go as far that it's not as sharp as my C300 Mark III, and maybe even a tad softer than the one on the EOS R6. And sometimes you do see a little bit more introduced into your footage, but it's really hardly noticeable. And overall, I really do like the 4K 50 coming out of the EOS R5. Next up is the 4K 100 or 120 frames. And I rarely use that on the EOS R5 because my C300 Mark III also shoots up to 180 frames, and it shoots in RAW, so I usually use that. But when shooting with the EOS R5, it really does look good. And as a matter of fact, we used it the other day when Bell was shooting on the ice with the C300 Mark III. So I was using the R5 and shot a little bit of behind the scenes. And I also used it in 4K 100. And you could actually see the comparison between this and the C300 Mark III. And the EOS R5 can definitely hold its own. Compared to the C300 Mark III, I want to say it's a little less sharp, but it's definitely really smooth, and I could totally see me using this a majority of the times if I really want to slow down my footage a lot. And the last thing that I'm shooting in is the 8K mode. I never really shoot in 1080 on the EOS R5. I think I never have, and I don't really see the point in it because I shoot everything in 4K or higher. So let's talk about the 8K for a second. And I rarely shoot in 8K just because of the massive file sizes, and my computer can't handle the 8K files, but I will talk about all that in a second. But when shooting in 8K, the image looks absolutely amazing, and it's RAW, so I have more dynamic range, so I can actually use C-Log 2 in Cinema Gamut. And as a matter of fact, I actually shot for ADP from Canada the other day, and we actually actually settled on shooting everything in 8K 24 frames. And he wanted me to do a complete one take, basically walking for 3 to 4 kilometers and not turning off the camera. I obviously had to turn off the camera after about 30 minutes for a second and then re-recording, and the image quality coming out of the 8K footage is absolutely amazing. For me personally, I don't really see that it's enough value for me to deal with the really hard to edit files as well as the big file size, but it's really nice for it to be there to have the option to actually shoot 8K that actually looks like a really good 8K. So next up on our list is the colors. And yes, everybody loves talking about the Canon color science, and I do love the colors coming out of my C300 Mark III or any other Canon camera that I have owned, and the EOS R5 is no different. There's one thing to note though, I shoot everything in C-Log, and I found that it does make sense for me at least to switch from EOS Original to the neutral mode when it comes to the C-Log settings, because I found that the EOS Original mode kind of messes up my colors. I used the R5 as a B cam to my C300 Mark III, and when shooting in EOS Original, it messes up your colors. So for example, the teal in the background wasn't teal anymore and it turned to blue, and some of the blues were turned to purple. So when you want to match cameras, or if you really want to have a natural look, then definitely switch to the neutral mode. I did find that the EOS Original does a little bit better on the skin tones, but again, it's not natural colors, so you always have to switch around some hues if you really want to have a fair representation of what you were shooting. So speaking of matching cameras, I used the EOS R5 with my C300 Mark III a lot of the times for interview setups and commercial works, or even as a gimbal cam. And in the beginning I had a really hard time of matching these two cameras. The cameras on the EOS R5 looked totally different most of the times, and it was really hard to match. And I found out that this is due to how the EOS R5 handles white balance, and it does that differently than on my C300 Mark III. For example, if you set both cameras to 5600 Kelvin, you get totally different results. So what I use is a gray card on every shoot that I use both of these cameras at the same time, and I set my custom white balance to each of these cameras. After doing so, they match very well, and it's really easy to get the same image out of both cameras, and that is a great addition for my C300 Mark III when I'm shooting multicam interviews, to have the EOS R5 or use it as a dedicated gimbal cam and not really have to worry about matching colors in post. One thing I do have to mention though is that setting the custom white balance on the R5 is an absolute pain in the butt. On my C300 Mark III, I just pointed at the gray card, hit the white balance button, and it does all the rest. On the EOS R5, I have to switch into photography mode, I have to take a picture of the white balance card, then go back into video mode and import my settings into my picture profile. And that is really annoying. When we were shooting that commercial that I mentioned earlier, we shot all the talking head parts on the gimbal on the EOS R5. And then we switched over to the C300 shooting handheld for all the B-roll parts. And we were shooting in different locations, outdoors, indoors, and we had to set the custom white balance every time we just switched rooms. And with that kind of workaround on the EOS R5, that becomes really annoying pretty quickly. And speaking of colors, let's talk a little bit about color grading. And I always found it very easy to grade C-Log footage. And I actually made a dedicated video about that, where you can actually grade this footage within 30 seconds. So I will link it up here so you can check it out. And usually my process is I shoot everything in C-Log, I just bring it back to Rec 709, and that's just by adding a little bit of contrast and saturation to it, and all of a sudden it already looks good. The next step I do is I just take one of our Canon LUTs and put it on top, just level the intensity, and that's it. And that's how easy you can get really good looking footage out of the EOS R5. And all of our LUTs are on our website to purchase. I put a link in the description below, and if you use the code EOS R5, you get 10% off just for watching this video. So yeah, overall I really like using the Canon EOS R5 and color grading it, because it's so easy, especially when using it as a behind the scenes camera. I can easily get the results that I'm looking for, and I don't really need to fiddle with skin tones, and I do have a lot of latitude in the footage as well, as I was mentioning earlier when it comes to the dynamic range, because yes, you do have a lot of wiggle room to play with, and you can really use the footage before it starts to break. Another thing, unfortunately, I have to mention when talking about the image quality of the EOS R5 is the dynamic range. And unfortunately, it's not great. As a matter of fact, technically, it's the same as on the original EOS R, and that already wasn't great. In reality, it is a little bit better though. With a 4K 10-bit 422 codec, you have a lot more wiggle room. It's also better in low light, and I will talk about this in a second. But with that, you can actually expose for the highlights more and then bring up the shadows and the blacks a little bit more. And where the original EOS R completely fell apart every time I did that, the EOS R5 actually holds its own very well. So with this trick, you can actually get a little bit more dynamic range out of it. But when shooting with it side by side with the C300 Mark III, you immediately see a really big difference of dynamic range. For us lately, within the last 3 months, that really wasn't that big of an issue though, because the weather isn't really great and we shot a lot of stuff indoors, and there you really don't see that big of a difference, and the dynamic range on the R5 is totally fine. If you were to shoot a lot of stuff outdoors with backlit situations and a really blue sky, then you would immediately see a huge difference between the R5 and the C300 Mark III, for example. There are a lot of rumors out there that they will implement C-Log 3 or maybe even C-Log 2, and I don't think that this is true later, and you might get a half a stop, maybe an entire stop more out of the C-Log 3 on the EOS R5, and I'm really hoping for that. But as of it is right now, the dynamic range really isn't that great. Last thing on the image quality list is the low light capabilities, and it's alright. It's not as great as on a Sony a7S III, and subjectively it's not even as good as on an EOS R6. And I talked about this in my R6 review, that yes, subjectively, if you put both of these cameras side by side, crank up the ISO a lot, then the R6 does look a lot better straight out of camera. Unfortunately, the R6 applies a lot of noise reduction to the footage afterwards, and I don't like that I don't have any control over it. In some situations, that looked actually great out of camera, and in other situations, it completely destroyed all the detail in the shot. So in general, I think that I do prefer the EOS R5 when it comes to these high ISO values, and it also holds the colors a little bit better than the EOS R6, for example. And I do have full control over my noise reduction, and with a tool like Neat Video, that is doing an amazing magical job when using it on really noisy footage. I do like having the EOS R5, that it has more detail in it and better colors when using a tool like Neat Video. If you're really running and gunning and you don't want to do anything to your footage afterwards, especially Neat Video because that takes forever to render, then the R6 might be a better option in low light, but overall it really held its own. Another thing I really like talking about when talking about the EOS R5 is the autofocus. And I would hands down say that the EOS R5, along with the EOS R6, has the best autofocus in the industry right now. I did a really brief unscientific comparison to the a7S III ones, where I was just seeing which camera focuses on my subject's eye a little bit faster, and the R5 was about half a second to a second faster every time, which really isn't that big of a deal, but overall I think that the R5 has the best autofocus of any camera right now. And yes, there were times where I had to choose between the C300 Mark III as well as the R5, and I chose the R5 just because of the autofocus. I usually don't use autofocus when shooting handheld or basically anything else than on a gimbal, but when shooting on a gimbal in certain situations you do need that autofocus if you don't have a dedicated focus puller, which quite frankly we never have. So when shooting on the ice, for example, when there's people really crossing the frame, going around, jumping, the C300 really did a poor job of keeping Bell's subjects in focus. The EOS R5 on the other hand had absolutely no problems, and with its deep algorithm, artificial intelligence, it's really great. So even when your subject is turning around, it still keeps focus on the back of the head. It finds its eye where the C300 didn't even find the face, and overall the autofocus is absolutely amazing. And a lot of the times I chose the R5 over the C300 for that reason. You also have so many different kind of cool things to choose between the autofocus settings, and I put them all to my thumb wheel so I can quickly change between my tracking mode, my autofocus, as well as just my selectable focus fields. And that feature is absolutely amazing and a game changer for me. And if you do need autofocus, the R5 is the way to go. Another thing that I want to address that I also addressed in the R6 video is the IBIS Wobble, and that looks horrible. When using the R5 with the 15-35, you get a lot of situations where the outer sides of your image are completely jello-y wobbly, and you can really not use that footage in a professional setting, in my opinion. Yes, you can turn off the image stabilization on the lens and then it's going away, but that also turns off the image stabilization of the camera itself, so you don't have any image stabilization at all. But when using it with the 16-35 and an adapter on the EOS R5, you don't have any stabilization in your lens, but you still have the image stabilization in your camera. And with that, I had no problems of that wobbling image stabilization. So for me, that is really a bummer, because the 15-35 is a really great lens in theory, but for me, when shooting on the R5, I'm choosing the 16-35 over it, because I feel like I get more benefits of the image stabilization and not have to worry about this wobble. So now let's address the elephant in the room, and that is overheating, because obviously a lot of people are worried about the overheating of the R5. And for me, I can honestly say I had absolutely no issues with it whatsoever. I only got the overheating warning once in the last 4 months, and that is when I shot a talking head here in the studio in 8K for about 35 minutes. And after about 35 minutes, I got the warning. The camera never overheated because I turned it off. But other than that, I shot with it as a B cam for the C300 for 2 hours in 4K regular 25 mode. I also used it for a yoga session where we also shot for about 70 minutes in 4K 25. Absolutely no problems. When shooting in 4K 50 mixed with 4K 120, also never even had the sign pop up. So overall, for the shoots that we do, there's absolutely no problems. And I mentioned briefly in the beginning that I worked for a Canadian director the other day, and we were choosing the EOS R5. And that is because of its waterproof and lightweight, because he basically wanted me to do a one take. So I was actually filming in 8K for 30 minutes, turning it off, filmed for another 30 minutes. I shot 1.1 terabyte in basically one go, and the overheating warning didn't even turn on once. Granted, this was outdoors and it was barely snowing, so it was really cold outside, but that goes to show that when you're actually in a setting that is cool, you really don't have any problems with overheating. That might be different if you're shooting in the Vegas desert and then shooting 8K, but I heard of people actually shooting entire weddings in 8K in Vegas in the summer and not having any problems at all. So overall, unless you need to record for long times in 4K HQ, or you need to shoot a lot of 4K 100, 120, I really wouldn't worry about the overheating. Yes, when using this in a professional setting and this is your only camera, there's always this little bit of doubt in the back of your mind, and you do look at the remaining time most of the times, and it does add a little bit of a stress level. So overall, I really don't like that it is there. But for me, in all the settings that I have used it with, I had absolutely no problems. Would I use the EOS R5 as my absolute main only camera in all of the shoots that I do without worrying? Probably not, but it still wouldn't be enough to persuade me to go with Sony cameras or any other brand instead of the EOS R5 because of the overheating, because as I've already said, I had absolutely no problems with overheating whatsoever. So last, I want to talk about the files and codecs, and this was something that I already complained about way before I even had the camera in my hand, and well, I was right. Editing these files is an absolute nightmare. Even on my really expensive 2020 iMac, I can't play back those files and I have to transcode either into proxies or ProRes every time, which is annoying. It's not that big of a deal because if you're just shooting for yourself, you can just transcode them or just use proxies, whatever floats your boat and works in your workflow. But when shooting for external people, like we shot for a director and we shot in a documentary setting and we wanted to use the R5 as our B cam. But the way this works is we usually just offload the footage after the shoot and give it to the director directly, and I can't really justify giving him H.265 files that he can't open or edit or even transcode in most of the NLEs or dedicated programs for it. So this is definitely not a workaround. Another scenario we were recently in where this actually became a problem is when we were in Italy, and Bell had a job to film some figure skaters on the ice while they were doing their test runs, and there were some really high-level international judges there that wanted to go through the footage afterwards and just give them tips and tricks. And usually we would just offload it to the computer and they could look at the computer screen directly, scroll through the footage and, just make their notes. But since none of our MacBooks could actually play back these files, we had to transcode them first, and that took forever. So everybody was sitting there waiting for us. We could have lowered the quality, go 8-bit 420, but that's always not the best solution. If you buy a camera for its 4K 10-bit 422 and it's great quality, and then you have to go down in quality and not even be able to use C-Log. So yeah, there is scenarios where the not being able to edit these files becomes really problematic, but overall, if you do find your workflow, it's not that big of a deal. Plus, with the new M1 chips in the future, this problem is completely gone. So if you think of purchasing a new Mac within the next year, this problem is non-existent for you. And the next thing I also complained about is the file sizes, and they are enormous. As I've already said, I shot for this director in 8K, I shot over a terabyte, and that is just not sustainable. Even the 4K 120 is 1.7 gigabits, and that is more than 3 times of the data rate that my C300 Mark III shoots in when I shoot in 4K 120, and on the C300 Mark III I'm shooting RAW. So I can't really justify using that much space for this camera when I get so many better codecs and options with similar, less, or the same file sizes. Again, it's a trade-off that I'm willing to make because I just like the camera, the ecosystem, and I have a lot of hard drive space. But yeah, if you shoot a lot, then these file sizes on the EOS R5 are huge, and that might actually become a problem for you. Alright, now I've been talking for an hour, at least that's what my recorder says, so let's wrap this up and let me give you my overall verdict of the R5 as a dedicated video camera. Yes, I would totally recommend using the R5 as a dedicated video camera. If you're a hybrid shooter, even better, because I think the R5 is the best hybrid camera out there right now. The A7S III might have some better video features here and there, but overall when it comes to the mixture between photography as well as video, then the R5 is king. But when it comes to only videography, it's still an amazing camera. There is something that I really don't like, and I wish for the overheating to not be an issue at all. For me, in my line of work, it really hasn't been, but it's always a little bit of a stress factor that it's there, and maybe that changes in a really hot summer in the future. But overall, I really like having this camera as a dedicated video camera. The one thing that bugs me the most is the missing dynamic range. So that is one thing that I hope they will fix in a future firmware update. But as it is right now, it's really not the best camera as a dedicated video camera when all you're looking for is a really great dynamic range. So overall, I really like shooting on the EOS R5. Rigged up with an external monitor, cage, a top handle, it's a really great camera to be used as a dedicated video camera. It also has an amazing battery life that I didn't even talk about before, because I really don't think that I have to. That 8K one shot that I did for an hour, I only used one battery, so battery life on that camera is absolutely amazing. Overall, me personally, I still prefer shooting on my Canon C300 Mark III for some various reasons, but overall the R5 is an amazing camera when rigged up as a dedicated video shooter. So this video was very long, but I hope it was also informative, and if it was, please give this video a thumbs up because it really helps the channel grow. And if you haven't already, make sure to be subscribed because I will put out more content about the EOS R5 in the very near future, including the breakdown of the commercial we just shot, where I will be talking about how much budget we had, and I will be talking about money. And while you're at it, make sure to also follow me on Instagram because why not? And I hope to see you on the next one.